All right, hello and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series and Podcast. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Raymond Ibrahim, a Judith Friedman Rosen Fellow at the Middle East Forum and a Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Gatestone Institute, join us to discuss Christians who defended the West from Islamic Conquest, based on his latest book, Defenders of the West. Mr. Ibrahim will be speaking for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Raymond Ibrahim.
Thank you. The book that I recently wrote on the topic of discussion, the title of which is Defenders of the West, is it's impossible to even start talking about it without connecting it to its predecessor, its previous book, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. That book was focused on the 8 major pivotal decisive battles between the Islamic world and what we today call the West, which historically was Europe. It just showed you the progressive change actually on the map. So for example, all of North Africa and the Middle East was a heavy Christian majority with a large also Jewish minority. But it was more Christian than Europe itself. And you could see in just the first century after Muhammad's death, between 632 and 732, the Battle of Tours, all of North Africa and the Middle East was swallowed up. And then, of course, you have different manifestations later. You have the Turks who come in and they take Anatolia or Asia Minor, becomes Turkey today. Spain, of course, was conquered for centuries. And even in the book, it explains, as many people are unaware, but these Islamic sort of jihadist attacks went on in perpetuity, including reaching as far as Iceland in the 16th century, Denmark. And of course, America's first war as a nation was against Muslims, the Barbary Wars, where Jefferson met with the ambassador from Barbary, and the ambassador's reply as to why the Muslims of Barbary were attacking American sailors and enslaving them was straight out of ISIS's playbook. Basically said, we are called to do jihad, you're an infidel, Allah and our prophet command us of us, et cetera, et cetera. So that was Sword and Scimitar. The book did well, and actually this new book, Defenders of the West, was the idea was brought to me by the publisher himself, or themselves, Bombardier, and I thought it was a good idea. So what I did with this book was somewhat similar, and that's why I say it complements very much Sword and Scimitar. But instead of focusing on 8 decisive battles, I focused on what I refer to as 8 decisive men. So it's a more personalized view of what happened in that same time frame, essentially, and in the same theaters of war. The 3 of them basically being in the Holy Land, in Spain, and in the Balkans, all different iterations of Islamic jihadist aggression, of course. In the Balkans, you have the Ottomans primarily. In Spain, you have what were called the Moors, Muslims, of course, and in the Holy Land, you have a number of different sultans and caliphs. At any rate, one of the main, I guess, takeaways that I'm bringing out in this book, and which is what it is. It's not something that I tried to posit. It's there itself, it just shows you the difference between Christianity and how it was what one would refer to, or as Daniel Pipes referred to, is a muscular religion. And actually, I refer to it as that, but he mentions that in his blurb to the book. And I think that's a good place to sort of start, because it just shows you that while there was a massive assault on Europe during these centuries, the Christians of that time, unlike, let's say, today's Christians, were not passive. We're not worried about offending someone's feelings. We're not worried about being politically correct. We're not worried about stepping on anyone's toes. And they fought tooth and nail. And if they had not, of course, everything would have changed. In fact, to really underscore what I'm saying, and lest it seem that I'm making this all up, there's a really nice quote I'll read from US President Theodore Roosevelt, who himself was no mean historian. And this is what he wrote. He wrote, quote, "Christianity was saved in Europe solely because the peoples of Europe fought. If the peoples of Europe in the 7th and 8th centuries on up to and including the 17th century had not possessed a military equality with, and gradually a growing superiority over the Mohammedans who invaded Europe, Europe would at this moment be Mohammedan. and the Christian religion would be exterminated. Whenever the Mohammedans have had complete sway, wherever the Christians have been unable to resist them by the sword, Christianity has ultimately disappeared. So that's really the main takeaway. Even the book's entire epigraph, which I chose because I think it best characterizes the book, comes from the Hebrew scriptures, specifically Proverbs 25:26, which reads, quote, "Like a trampled spring and polluted well is a righteous man who gives way before the wicked." So I wanted to document that that's sort of how Europeans, like all peoples really, saw their civilization. They tried to defend it, irrespective of preaching about meekness or turning the other cheek or any of that sort of thing, which was understood in its own context. The stories of these various men, I should also add, are very in and of themselves. So one of the other reasons I could argue that I wrote the book is, these are just amazing stories. We're used to watching Hollywood and, these big budget movies, most of which are completely fictitious. But in these stories, oftentimes, as the saying goes, truth is stranger than fiction. The sorts of things that the Muslim invaders and jihadists did, for example, the Ottomans, the Ottoman assault on Albania. Let's take that as one example. There's 8 chapters, and I talk about 8 different men. The 7th chapter deals with Albania and Skanderbeg, whose real name was George Castrioti. And I'll just give you a quick summary of his story to give you an idea. So like so many nobles, he was born as a noble in Albania, but he had to be taken as a hostage at the Ottoman court. He was taken at the age of 10, and all his brothers. I think it was 4 brothers and himself. His 4 brothers were killed eventually, but he rose to the highest ranks and became a janissary. So a janissary, of course, is an Islamic slave soldier. Mostly they were taken from European men in their youth, converted forcibly to Islam, and then became great soldiers because they were trained like Spartans essentially, and then let loose on their former kin. So that's what happened with him, and he really raised up in the echelons and eventually had something like 5,000 men under his command, and he was very popular, liked by the Sultan. But then once he had the chance, and he was a grown man, so from the age of 10 till maybe mid-20s or even early 30s, he broke free, ran back to Albania, and essentially, he crossed the Rubicon, as it were, and it was just all war between him and the Ottomans, who saw him as a traitor. And in 25 years, they launched assault after assault on Albania. Oftentimes, as anyone who understands, the Ottomans' legendary size, the armies that are legendary sizes, which is true. So he was often fighting 1 to 10 odds at best, as far as numbers. So the Ottomans would marshal 100,000 men, and he'd have maybe 10,000 guerrilla fighters. But this went on and persevered for a quarter of a century. And what's interesting and what I document, again, is what I always find interesting is this continuity, which shows you that the Muslims, the Ottomans, the Turks, approached the entire thing through the very same lens of, let's say, the Islamic State. And basically, they would tell the Albanians and everyone else in Europe, you have 3 choices. You're either pay a submission, be in submission, pay tribute, jizya, or convert, of course, which they didn't, or fight. And those were the 3 alternatives offered to Albania and others. And then during the fights, the atrocities committed by the Ottomans are, they beg our description and possibly put ISIS to shame, skinning people alive, gouging their eyes, mass gang rapes of women and children, lots of horrific stuff, of course, burning of churches and that sort of thing. So I also find that it's important to document that, because we're told that that's not part of Islam proper, that ISIS has introduced this, and that historically caliphates and sultanates did not engage in that sort of behavior. But actually, that's what you see, and that's what the book demonstrates, that the prevalent mentality of the Muslims was that we're attacking you because you're an infidel, and you have to be in submission one way or the other, and there's no two ways about it. And the battles go on and on. And so that's so one can only imagine, with Skanderbeg, what a great movie that would make, for example. And he lived until old age fighting, and until he finally died in warfare. And once he died, it's interesting, and it actually, again, it emphasizes his stalwart stance against Islam. As we know, Albania today is actually a Muslim majority nation in Europe. And that's because, due to his and his men's defiance against Islam for so long. Once he was dead, and Albania came under the Ottoman orbit sphere, there was no more choice about being a dhimmi and paying tribute, or rather, it was very much a coercive and suffocating climate where you better convert, because if you are a dhimmi, it's going to be significantly worse, and you'll barely be able to live, and you'll be humiliated. And that's actually why Albania, of all these European nations around it, still has a very large Muslim population. So there's much that can be said and discussed about all of this. And I think, like I said, both these books, they show you sort of the history. It's amazing to me every day now when you listen to historians who talk about Islam and European interactions from a historical level, they always bring it up. It always starts off in a vacuum with the Crusades. Virtually every American has heard about the Crusades, but they don't know what happened 4 centuries before the Crusades, which was basically Islam invading and attacking Western nations, Christian nations, Europe, and Islamizing them. And then finally, the Crusades came because right before the Crusades was a particularly horrific jihad by the Seljuk Turks in Asia Minor. And they, according to the sources, for example, Matthew of Edessa, who's a contemporary, hundreds of thousands of Christians, especially Armenians, were being butchered alive. When we hear of the Turkish genocide of Armenians, we think of the 20th century and the 19th century, late 19th, but actually goes back 1,000 years earlier. And they had reached Constantinople, the Muslims, and this is what caused Alexius, the emperor, to call on the Pope to start the Crusades. But even after the Crusades, you see all these various different attacks. As I mentioned, it goes on and on and on, and it never ends, reaching to these furthest areas of Western civilization, including, like I said, the United States. So I think it's important to be cognizant of the true history of Islam vis-a-vis not just the West, but all civilizations really that are non-Islamic. And basically the fairy tales were being told about a sort of progressive Islam historically, and how the jihadists of today have hijacked it. And because, that as a first premise, if you believe that Islam was historically peaceful and tolerant, etc., then no matter what happens today, no matter how aggressive Muslims may be or scream jihad, you have to conclude that something different has happened. Something new has happened. There's a new element. That's why they're acting this way, because historically they were not that way. But if you understand that historically, Islam was like ISIS, like radical Muslims say it was, then today really does make sense. It just fits perfectly in. It's part of the pattern. It's a continuation. And I think that's what we're seeing. And it's important to be cognizant, as I mentioned, this otherwise distant or forgotten, or to some people irrelevant history, to understand what's really going on today, and whether it's an aberration, which it's not, but rather it's a continuation. And it's best to understand it that way to make sense of things. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
There it is. Sorry, I lost my mouse there. All right. Judith Hershen asked, what is taught in American universities on this? You spoke of a relevant history in that last line there. Has anyone tried to bring the history to the Middle East studies?
I'm understanding the question as basically saying the history that I just laid out, is that being, and no, it's not. It's, of course, I don't know, and nobody knows what every single professor in every single college is teaching, and I'm sure there's good ones. I personally know some good ones. But the overall narrative, the mainstream opinion, just like in everything else today in American society, there's the narrative, which it does you well to stick to and not stray from, of course, is that no, Islam was a very great progressive force. And if anything, when it comes to quarrels between the West and Islam, it was always the West's fault. And as the example I gave with the Crusades, they always begin it with the Crusades, which is essentially beginning with a no context, because there's actual well-known professors like John Esposito. He says, and I'm virtually verbatim quoting him, but basically he says 4 centuries of peace between Islam and the Western or Europe passed before papal power play came and the Crusades began, and that ruined all the relationships between Muslims and Europeans. And that's why Muslims are still upset This is, of course, absurd because it completely ignores 4 centuries of history before the Crusades and almost a millennium of history after the Crusades.
Thank you so much. Earl Simones asked, didn't the Muslims live in peace in Spain with other religions?
Did they? Is that the question? Yeah, they lived in peace so long as Islamic law was being enforced, and Islamic law's understanding is Muslims must be higher than infidels. Infidels means non-Muslims. In this case, it would have been Christians and Jews, both of which there were plenty in Spain. In some of the actual Spanish legal texts, Islamic legal texts, it would say things like Jews and Christians have to be pushed aside, they have to feel oppressed. So when you collect the jizya, the tribute they have to pay, you should yank them by the beard and humiliate them. So yeah, as long as that sort of atmosphere prevailed, I suppose there was peace. But as we know, the Reconquista or the Reconquest, because as I was mentioning, when the Muslims invaded Spain, the traditional date is 711, and conquered it, it was Visigothic, it was Christian rule, and they were all pushed up into the northwestern quadrant of the peninsula of Spain and holed up there. And from that small area, century after century, they started spreading out and reconquering massive parts of Spain. And it's interesting because those who talk about the golden age of Spain and, you know, how Jews and Christians and Muslims lived in peace, they often ignore the massive wars and the upheavals that went on, and which brought in sequence 2 very savage Islamic, what we would call today terror groups, the Almoravids and then the Almohads, to give them their sort of anglicized name, which were Berber groups from North Africa that actually dressed like ISIS. They wore black, and everything they cared about was jihad. And they entered in Spain and all sorts of atrocities, as you can imagine. But the people who talk about a golden age ignore those centuries, and they focus on Abdul Rahman, the Umayyad Caliphate, which lasted after the Abbasid took over. But even when you look at his reign and you really scrutinize it, as I have, they say it was progressive because this is a time when you actually had great architecture and it seems like a fabulous region, Spain. But when you look into it, this is also the time where Christians, for example, were tortured, boiled alive, and skinned alive for blaspheming against Muhammad, to give you an idea. Well, that sounds to me like the golden age was something straight out of ISIS's handbook. But again, they ignore and suppress that and focus on grand architecture, opulence, wealth, and learning, which there was. But again, like I said, they suppress the other aspects, which is the humiliation and persecution, discrimination against non-Muslims, Jews and Christians in this case.
Understood. An anonymous attendee asks, why is it that the narrative is so slanted? Is it related at all to the funding of think tanks and universities?
Well, the narrative got slanted, I think, even before there were think tanks. It's been slanted since, you can arguably say in the 17th century in Europe. I think a lot of it starts with the Protestant Reformation. And with the Protestant Reformation, there was this attempt to break away from anything that was Catholic and also to demonize it and basically say, well, that's bad, we're good. And so, for example, Martin Luther preached passivity against the Ottoman attack coming into Europe originally. For example, when they were encircling Vienna the first time, I believe in 1529, until, of course, the Muslims got close to where he was in Germany. And then he said, no, it is our right to fight back and so forth. So I think a lot of it has to do with this sort of split between Christian sects and trying to demonize the other and stay away. So the Crusades, in that sense, I think were very much demonized to show how crazy and horrible the Catholic Church was. And for the record, and I emphasize this in the book, I in no way, shape, or form do I endorse everything that these men or their times represent. I mean, these are not exemplars in all ways, as I express in the book. And I'm just focused on their militant, confident stance against Islamic aggression. So I think it starts with the Protestant Reformation, but I do believe, of course, now as you come into the modern era, that it is funding, It is, these sorts of, just again, it's the narrative. It's a prominent narrative, and you can't stray from it. If you do, your livelihood is likely in danger, just like with everything else that's happening today.
Along those lines, Robert Slater asks, are you banned from many universities as a speaker in the US or Europe because of your views?
Yeah, I would say that. A lot of places that would reach out to me, and then later they would rescind for no meaningful reason. The most famous one was with the War College. To recap, I think this was in 2019, and I had been invited to speak at the War College about Sword and Scimitar, my previous book, which is a military history. So it makes sense that a military school wants to hear a military history. And then CARE, of course, found out, got wind, started a hysterical petition and campaign against me, called the college racist, called me, a man of Egyptian background, racist. And before long, the War College actually rescinded its invitation. But about a year later, because it got some headlines and petitions, and lots of people were involved, and apparently the college was getting lots of scathing emails, they did re-invite me. And I actually gave that talk in February of 2020. And one of the deals was they were supposed to videotape it and release it. But February 2020, of course, is right at the time of COVID when that came up. And since then, they haven't released it because of COVID. For some reason, they just haven't been able to get to it because of whatever issues COVID has created for them. But yeah, in general, I've definitely been banned and lost many other opportunities, actually, because of speaking this way.
Oh, sorry to hear that. Mike asks, are we in the beginning years of a new crusade with Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, with any country that is called for jihad on the Western world?
A new crusade, as in, is the West going to marshal a new crusade against those nations? Oh, I don't think so. Not at all. So in the book, in Defenders of the West, again, one of the themes is to compare and contrast how those men live their lives vis-a-vis Islamic aggression, how they responded, with today. And today, of course, is the exact opposite. And again, I think it's clothed or garbed oftentimes in Christian virtues. But to me, a lot of people, when they talk about being passive and turning the other cheek, they're basically making a virtue out of cowardice, and it's not necessarily because this is their faith. So I think there's a lot of the sort of general feel amongst Western people, Christians and non-Christians, secularists, everything. I think it's just so passive. They don't want to ruffle feathers or be confrontational, and that's why you see what's happening in the world. I mean, look at what happened in Afghanistan. That's just it's still amazing that after all that, over 20 years and fighting Islamic terrorists, everyone knew the Taliban were Islamic terrorists, no less than Al-Qaeda. And, they have the same exact ideology. And then to just after that, throw it all away and all that blood and treasure. And then here we go again. The Taliban is still in power, still doing what they've been doing always, terrorizing people, engaging in terrorism. And when you think, what's also amazing is if you compare the West's actual strength vis-a-vis Islam, economic strength, military strength, there's no contest. Whereas in the history that I discuss, oftentimes the Islamic world was much more militarily and economically powerful and larger than Europe. And they resisted tooth and nail. And so it's interesting to see today that now the West is so much more powerful, and yet it's being terrorized by, essentially weak civilization. And that's because it's being enabled. You look at some of these European nations like Sweden, which, I mean, when you see what the Muslim population is doing there, it's become essentially the rape capital. Rape has jumped up something like 1,500%, and crime has jumped up something like 3,000% since Muslim migrants have started coming in there. You realize, well, it's not because these are Muslims coming with spears and swords, screaming Allah Akbar as they did historically, and either conquering or being rebuffed. These are people who are being brought in, and anyone who criticizes this, he's the bad one. And then they engage in the sorts of things they do. There's enclaves all over Europe. You had the grooming scandal in England, Rotherham, I believe. Same sorts of things are happening in Germany. But you look at other countries in Eastern Europe, for example, and they have no problem because they don't allow let's say, Islamic migration. So my point is, obviously, so much can be done, but Western civilization in general seems to be so demoralized and just pacified that anything can be done. So much can be done. I'm not even referring to using military might. That isn't even necessary because America and the West are that strong, but they just don't, and it makes one wonder why. And more to the point, it's not that they don't do anything; they are the ones who are creating this problem by, for example, bringing in millions of migrants and so forth.
Thank you. Len asks, it seems today many Christian religious groups support Islamic organizations. Are Islamists today less antagonistic against Christians than they were years ago? And Andrea Spindell follows up, what is the political view of the Global Imam Council in regards to other faiths?
Well, that's the first question. Absolutely, there's a lot of this sort of ecumenicism going on, which is, and it's best typified to me by Pope Francis, who just constantly likes to reach out and meet with Muslims, particularly the Egyptian Grand Imam of Al Azhar University, Sheikh Ahmed Al Tayyib. And just to give you an idea, because I can read and I watch Arabic videos of the Sheikh, but he'll meet with the Pope and they'll send out these grand, statements about brotherly love between Muslims and Christians and Jews, because all the religions will meet up together. Most recently in Dubai, they had an actual large conference. And they'll say all these sorts of things that sound good, and the Sheikh will sign his name. But then if you listen to him talking in Egypt or to Muslims in general and his actual fatwas, they're pretty radical. He's on record saying if you're an apostate, you should basically be punished with a suggestion of death. And that's of course mainstream Islamic teaching. He's on record saying anyone who blasphemes should be also punished and so forth. So anything he won't denounce the Islamic State, ISIS, and say they're not Islamic. He refuses to say that. He say, well, maybe they're wayward, but I can't say they're not Islamic because as long as they profess the Shahada, then they're Islamic. So, again, it's very, very two-faced, and it's unfortunate because the Christians who do this sort of thing and reach out and try to have an ecumenical relationship with Muslims basically are naive and they're being duped. And it's very, very obvious, like I said, especially in these high-profile cases that I've been following. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Jay Lewis here sums up this talk pretty well. So what is the lesson for today's Christians, especially those who are being attacked in places like Africa, Bethlehem, etc.? Is the lesson that they must start fighting back, and how?
Well, so the lesson of the book is not necessarily very applicable in this situation. Christians, as I cover in the Islamic world, Christian minorities are under attack. Fighting back is not very practical because they can't get the sorts of arms that are necessary. And if they do, then they are really dead because they're seen as barely tolerated dhimmis, okay? And we tolerate them as long as they just toe the line. And of course, we attack and abuse them whenever we feel because they did something that annoyed us. But if Christians were actually seen as trying to attack and fight Muslims or even defend themselves with arms, then the entire Islamic nation would rise up against them, including the military. So that's not really a practical, or this isn't the same as the stories I'm talking about in Europe, where all the Europeans, that was their home and Muslims were invading and the Europeans armed themselves and fought. So I don't think that's practical for Christian minorities who are sometimes 1 or 2%. I mean, think about it in Pakistan, where they're under 2% and they're treated like garbage, to be frank. Imagine if they got guns or whatever and started saying we're defending ourselves. They'd be essentially obliterated. But I think the lesson is more applicable to the West in general, and because it is the West's ancestors that we're discussing, in taking a firmer stance against Islamic aggression, including in ways to help Christians and other religious minorities throughout the Islamic world, which would not require military intervention, just economic intervention. Think of all these nations that get so much monetary aid and depend on it from America. All the US has to say is you need to improve your human rights or you get nothing, for example. And I guarantee you that would have a very significant improvement in the lives of those religious minorities, but seldom does the US do that except for show. So I think the lessons are more pertinent to the West and its Christians and non-Christians as well, to basically take a firmer, bolder stance against unjust, unwarranted Islamic aggression.
All right. Well, thank you so much. With that, we've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you, Mr. Ibrahim, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Of course, for our viewers, please be on the lookout for our weekly webinar offerings email coming out over the weekend. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Oh, sorry, before we go, can you tell us where we can get your book?
Oh, sure. It's actually right. It's right here because I was reading the quotes. Defenders of the West. You can get it if Amazon obviously has it, and it's probably the least expensive on Amazon. But if you just go on the internet and put in the name Defenders of the West and my name, Raymond Ibrahim, I'm sure you'll see a lot of other online sellers that you can choose from. And also conservativereader.com is selling it. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I believe it's one of our gifts with a donation on our donation page. All right. Well, thank you so much again. That's all we got today. Have a good one.